Hey noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and today we are looking at the top 10 myths about ancient Rome you thought were true. Also, as you watch this list, let me know in the comments below which of these myths you actually believe to be true and which of these you already knew were not true. Starting right off the bat with number 10, the Roman gods were the same as the Greek gods, they just had a different name. To be 100% honest with you, this is something I used to believe too. It is a widespread misconception that the Romans and the Greeks had the exact same gods. These gods weren't the exact copy of the Greek counterparts. The Roman pantheon was definitely strongly influenced by the Greek pantheon, but it wasn't just copy-pasted. Even though some of the gods were entirely borrowed, such as Apollo, whom in fact doesn't have a Latin version, other gods belonged to a native Roman pantheon. We shouldn't really imagine that the Romans replaced their own gods with Greek gods. They eventually merged them together into a new entity, which contained traits of the existing native gods and new traits coming from the Greek counterparts. The name Jupiter and Zeus, for example, have been traced by linguists to a common Proto-Indo-European name, meaning father. Even though the Greek Poseidon or Poseidonas was the Greek god of the seas, the Roman counterpart Neptunus wasn't always that. It will eventually become the god of the seas, but initially was the god of fresh waters and, you could say, springs. I would need a dedicated video to tell you every single difference and every single point of similarity between each single one of the gods, even if we simply focused on the 12 Olympians. I will tell you right now 3 main differences when it comes to the religion seen as a whole. First, the physicality of the gods. For the Greeks, the gods were a fully fleshed out sort of beings. They had very usually muscular, very tangible, human-like bodies, and even in their interactions with mankind and humanity, it was very much of a physical interaction, given sometimes the gods could shapeshift and turn into animals and mythological creatures of sorts. But in general, we can safely say that the gods were very tangible, very physical for the Greeks. For the Romans, the gods were instead invisible, and their manifestations happened more at a mental apparition sort of thing. So the gods had the power to manifest themselves to you in a sort of visual way, but they weren't as tangible and physical and fully fleshed out as the Greek counterparts. Now, eventually the Romans will start to also create their own statues and representations of the gods that we can see have a full-on body, but then again, even those representations will be different. It will be more militaristic, and oftentimes the gods won't be wearing just robes like the Greeks did, but they will be wearing armor. Another difference is the approach to divination. For the Greeks, divination was a sort of random, if you will, connection to the gods. It was based on the will of the gods. They could choose a man or a woman, say Cassandra, to just become a sort of recipient overnight. For the Romans instead, divination was very much of a very well organized science that you needed to study, go to certain places and schools to learn all the techniques, all the ingredients. It was something you needed to study. The Greek gods have many godlike attributes. They are wise, they are powerful, they are strong, but they also have very human-like attributes. They can be jealous, they can be impatient, they can be angry and vindictive. The Romans instead sort of removed the negative and human-like attributes from the gods and worshipped them, or generally speaking represented them, as powerful beings, wise beings in the majority of cases. Now, for one of the points on this list, I will have to literally take my pride as an Italian and just throw it out the window and just say how things actually were. We will get to that, you'll know when we get there, and I hope you'll appreciate. But before we do that, I'd like to mention the sponsor that made this video possible. The sponsor for this video is the graphic novel Long Live the Emperor, created by Jaron Green and published by Summertime Studios. Long Live the Emperor is a graphic novel set in the fantasy realm of Orlan, which follows the epic military struggles between 2 opposing powers trying to overcome and outsmart each other. Now, one really cool thing about this epic graphic novel is the fact that Jaron Green, the author, is also a HEMA practitioner and a subscriber to this channel. So what he tried to do, it was to try and introduce realistic combat into what is otherwise a fantasy scene, creating a very interesting blend both at a battle scale and individual single combat. And to make this more realistic and compelling, he also studied deeply The Art of War by Sun Tzu. The book is already available in Italian and other languages are also planned, and now will be really a good time to start getting into the Tales of Orlan, also because Jaron is halfway through with his sequel, the second book, which should get out hopefully this year. So click the link in the description below, get your copy, and by doing so you will also be supporting my show because I get a percentage from each sale. And thank you very much Jaron Green and Summertime Studio for sponsoring my video. Number 9. The gladiators were all slaves and they were all men. This might be a little bit of a misunderstanding, particularly if all your exposure to how ancient Roman gladiators functions comes from Hollywood movies. You see, in Hollywood movies we always see the gladiators die all the time, which is kind of a oversimplification. Yes, some gladiators would die, but they wouldn't be killed all the time because that would be extremely expensive and problematic. But regardless of that, we always see gladiators being men in the majority of cases, not all movies, but in the majority of cases they're always men and they are always considered as slaves. They've got to do it, they wouldn't want to be there, but they have to do it because otherwise they'll get killed. And maybe, only maybe, if they can finally win and become champions, they will be given freedom from the emperor. It is also important to say that a lot of gladiators were gladiators by profession. They decided to go into a school and become a gladiator. Why would a free citizen, particularly a Roman one, decide to do that? Well, multiple possible reasons. It could be lucrative. Maybe you didn't have anything else to do. Maybe you were good at fighting and you thought, hey, I've got the body, I've got the physicality. I'm just going to do this for a few years, make some money, become famous, and then, retire. But also some people had debts. They were, persecuted by sharks. They were living a complete financial disaster, and so they thought, you know what? I'm just gonna go and try. And this in a way connects to the fact that not all gladiators were murdered anyway, so yes, you could die, but maybe you won't. And the idea that they were all males is wrong, because there is a specific class or gladiatorial class called gladiatrix, female gladiators, usually fighting against each other rather than having a woman fighting against a man, but still, female gladiators existed and fought half naked with their breasts exposed. Hey. The Romans liked what they liked, I suppose. Number 8. As I was saying, for the next point, I need to sort of swallow my Italian pride and just say things as they were. The Latin spoken by the Romans, particularly in the late Republican times and early Imperial times, was not just Latin with an Italian accent. As Italians, we tend to be very protective towards Latin because, of course, it's a language that was born in our land, and it's clearly a language that is strongly connected to both modern Italian and even more so to Sardinian. And therefore, whenever we hear someone who comes from an Anglophone background, for example, an American, a British, or even someone from Germany who tries to speak Latin, we immediately notice some things that, that sounds too English, or that sounds too American, or too German. But someone I have to admit, as an Italian who has studied classical Latin pronunciation, I have to say that if you just try and read it and pronounce it the way you would as a modern Italian, you would also make different mistakes than someone coming from an Anglophone background, but you would still not sound authentic. Even though in Italian the M at the end of words would always be strongly pronounced and fully pronounced, so if I had to read this with an Italian accent I would say Imperium Romanum. This M, fully pronounced M, is specifically considered by ancient Roman language teachers and Latin teachers as something a barbarian would do. To pronounce it like a real Roman, you need to pretend that the M is not there, which is interpreted by linguists as being fully nasalized. So the proper pronunciation would be Imperium Romanum. Not something an Italian would do naturally, but it is something, for example, a Portuguese speaker would do. Also, the length of vowels can be difficult for any speaker, regardless of where they are. You see, in Latin there is something called phonemic length, which means that some vowels will be long and some vowels will be short. The place in which the Romans would lengthen vowels is often something that would not come naturally to any speaker, including Italians. And the third point would be the S. If you want to sound like an original Latin speaker from the late Republic or early Imperial time, then your S should sound more like the final S in Madrid Spanish than the final S in the majority of Italian pronunciations, including Standard Italian. However, to that I do need to add a caveat, that if you are from a region such as, for example, Emilia-Romagna or perhaps Friuli, then a lot of speakers will have the same S that was used by the ancient Romans and it is used in modern day Madrid Spanish as their default S. For example, that's not my default S because I'm from Sicily, but my dad, who's from Friuli, already has that S as his default system. This is not a way to say that an Italian cannot sound authentic. I still think an Italian has a great advantage, particularly if he's from Sardinia, but the idea of, well, I'm Italian, so without any phonetic training and any study of sorts, I can immediately sound super authentic is wrong and is a myth. Number 7. Centurions were officers in charge of 100 soldiers. This one I'm being a little nitpicky, so excuse me if that's the case, but it is something that I've heard people say quite often, particularly in forums when I like reading stuff about this, and even though it very much depends on what era we're talking about, in general, whenever you say that a centurion is an officer in the Roman army in charge of 100 soldiers, this is not exactly correct. That is because, generally speaking, a century is composed of 80 fighting men, 80 soldiers and 20 slaves, which means that what the centurion is in charge of is indeed 100 men, but 80 combatants. So 80 soldiers under the command of a centurion, 20 slaves, people that would take care of the camp or help you bring stuff, carry stuff, taking care of food. Sometimes you've got the first century, which will be a double strength century, so the centurion on that century is actually commanding 160 fighting men and 40 slaves. So again, the number will depend, and in Republican times money pools worked differently, but just saying that the centurion commands 100 soldiers is a bit of a misnomer. Number 6, the ancient Romans were short. This one drives me nuts every time I see it, and if you look at this picture that I found on a post on a Facebook page about ancient Rome, you can see that this is pure and simple misinformation. First of all, there is more difference between a modern man from 2022 from Italy and a modern man from 2022 from Holland than there is between a modern Italian from 2022 and an ancient Italian from 22. Secondly, these differences, even though they were there, generally speaking, on average, more on that word in a minute, but on average, the adult male from, say, modern-day Italy will be a bit taller than the average adult male from ancient Rome. 180 is not the average of modern-day Italy. That's wrong. And the difference that we see here, the idea of we would be colossi compared to the Romans, is completely wrong. Yes, on average, the ancient Romans would have been a bit shorter than what we are. It would very much depend on the sort of nutrition that the person had access to. And because average is just that, average is you can totally have a modern day Italian like me, I'm 175, and you could totally have an ancient Roman who was taller than me, like 180. They were a little rarer, but they still existed. And even though we do know from Vegetius, Roman writer, that in general strength was more important than height, the Romans still liked it when you could be both tall and strong. And we know that because there are very specific legions that were kind of elite legions, we could say, where they did increase the average height limitation or standard for that specific legion, particularly if they were a cavalry corps. If you want more details on this, I already have a dedicated video. Just be careful because the units of measure in that video, they are correct when it comes to centimeters, but I didn't do a good job translating them into feet. I sometimes get confused with imperial system. I'm very sorry about that, but the centimeters are correct. So maybe you can do your own Googling. Again, I apologize for the mistake. Number 5, the Romans were a bloodthirsty people. This I again have addressed in details on my video Were the Ancient Romans Evil, but it is important to kind of touch on it very briefly on this one too. When we watch films and movies that are set in ancient Rome, one of the first things we see is how people enjoy seeing slaves being devoured by lions and gladiators killing each other and blood everywhere, and my gosh, these people are so bloodthirsty, it's disgusting. Instead, we modern people are very different. We are so moral in comparison. Well, this is a wrong approach into trying to understand an ancient people. It's true, gladiatorial combat was violent, but so is MMA. I mean, how many top 10 best KOs in MMA videos are there? And you could say the same about any other full contact martial art or sport. I don't think that the Romans were that different from us. They enjoyed a certain level of sport violence. Some people were sick in the head and just enjoyed seeing people suffer, but that happens today too. And I want to say that the majority of the population was just like us. They enjoyed watching a little bit of combat, particularly if they were guys. Humans are humans. It's important not to demonize people from the past, just so we can feel better about ourselves. Number 4. Julius Caesar, or Julius Caesar, was the first emperor. Now, this myth might not be as common thanks to, the spread of educational channel and in general the accessibility we've got through the internet, but I still remember a friend of mine, maybe even two friends of mine, calling Julius Caesar the emperor. Julius Caesar, and that is incorrect. Julius Caesar was not an emperor. We could say he was the first transitional dictator that sort of ends the republic and at least paves the way towards the beginning of the empire, an imperial focused centralized power. Because he got assassinated, he never got to become an emperor, and it's his nephew that will become one. Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus Augustus will be the first emperor with that specific title. And I think the confusion comes from the fact that emperors will adopt the term Caesar, and they will add it to their name. As I was saying before, the first emperor's name is Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus Augustus. So he does have both Julius, because he belongs to the Julia family, or gens Julia, and Caesar, because that's sort of a title that he's adopting. There were many Roman emperors, even within the first century alone. Again, dedicated video to all the emperors of the first century in the description box. But Julius Caesar wasn't one of them. Number 3. The Romans had iron, but not steel. I believe there are still quite a lot of people, might be wrong, but I still think it's quite popular, that think that steel is a modern commodity. And that's because there is a sort of disconnect, wrong overlapping between the notion of mass-produced steel, which is absolutely a sort of more modern invention, and steel itself in its definition, whether it be low carbon, medium carbon, and high carbon, so the addition of carbon to iron. Steel, not mass-produced steel, is something that has been around since the Iron Age. The fact that we call it Iron Age is mostly because the tools that were used by people were made of iron. And without going into a nomenclature battle between what is wrought iron and what is pure iron and what should already be considered steel, it is an absolute fact that the Romans had access to steel. Number 2. The ancient Romans died young. Oh, good luck getting past 27 years old. You're not gonna do it. If you were an ancient Roman and now you are 30, you'd be already dead. This is again one of those misconceptions that come from this idea of let's talk about averages without really understanding what an average is. Without going into much detail about this, but first of all, when you discuss an average, you're also putting inside the pool infant mortality, which clearly was higher than it is today. And even though it is true that today we have access to obviously better medicine, better understanding of the human body, better nutrition, although on that one I will make a dedicated video because yeah, we understand a lot more about nutrition and vitamin, but then again we eat a lot of horrible junk that they didn't, and we have a lot more access to sugar, so I'm not so sure that the nutrition we have today is actually better. Maybe if you are a fitness maniac and you watch your calorie and make sure you eat your protein and you are very careful, then absolutely your diet will be much better than that of an ancient Roman. But when we look at the average Joe that goes to McDonald's 6 times a week, if I had a choice, do you want to eat like him or do you want to eat like an ancient Roman? I'm gonna say ancient Roman for health reasons. Yes, we have a higher life expectancy, also thanks to modern medicine, but no, the Romans didn't die in their 20s, also because, even the legionaries, depending on what era we are talking about, were supposed to serve for 14 years, sometimes even 20 years. If you enlist at age 17 and you're gonna be in the army for 20 years as a norm, that wouldn't make sense if you were expected to die in 10 years, if you were lucky. And we do know that there are mentions of ancient Romans that reached age 80. So yes, they died a little younger than us on average, but no, they didn't all die in their 20s. Number 1. The Romans prayed with wooden swords and shields twice the weight of the real ones to become stronger. This is a half and half. It's a half-truth, if you will. It's not a complete myth. It is true that we know that at least some legions, we don't know if all legions did it, but definitely some legions, it has been reported. One of the reasons why they did that is because the Romans believed that it would literally make them faster and stronger when they were using the regular stuff that was half the weight. Now, even though it's true that again some legions did it, not all, as far as we understand, we don't know how spread it was, the myth part of this structure, of this sentence, is that when usually people say it, they mean it as if it actually worked, whereas modern science and research is showing us that probably it was more of a placebo effect that didn't really have that much of a beneficial result for the Romans. So the myth is not that they did it, some did, although sometimes it's overstated as if everybody did it in all eras. Not only it didn't really make that much of a difference, but also that it could have some negative effects, because if you get used to training with a sword that has a different point of balance or is in general a lot heavier than the real sword, then your muscle memory will be used to that. And so when you use the actual sword, even if you were faster, you're not really used to that weight and you're not really used to that sort of balance, and that might have some negative effects. If you want to check out more in details, Matt Easton at Schola Gladiatoria has a dedicated video to this with bibliography in the description. And this concludes this top 10 list. Please let me know if you liked this video. If you did, please remember thumbs up, and if you're not yet members of this community, become a noble one. Subscribe to my channel for more content from the Metatron. Also, the Romans didn't do this, so as another maybe number 11, I don't know. Don't forget to use the link in the description to order your copy of Long Live the Emperor. Thank you very much for watching, and remember, the Metatron will spread his wings. Goodbye.